What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Juventus versus Chelsea in their Champions League matchup. And before we start, check out both my books, Insight and Rotations. There's links in the description below. Also, check out Keyframe. It's how I make these videos. There's a link to that as well in the description. But let's get right into it. So Juventus ended up winning the match 1-0 against Chelsea in Italy. And how they did this was by first building from the back against Chelsea's high block. So the biggest phase of the match was Juventus's defensive phase. Chelsea dominated possession for most of the game and looked to control Juventus. So when Juventus was able to exploit the space in Chelsea's game model, this is when they got chances and were able to isolate defenders or players in possession. So Juventus lined up in a pretty asymmetric structure, looking to then play from a 4-3-3 to start, with then oftentimes one of the forwards in their last line of attack dropping in to create an off-centered 4-diamond-2 structure, with dual width on the right-hand side and the asymmetry created on the left-hand side. Chelsea lined up in their usual 5-2-3 or shifting between a 5-3-2. So Lukaku on the left-hand side, with Ziyech and Havertz playing alongside him. And then now their press would go from out to in, looking to block off passes to their fullbacks. But to compensate for this, we had Marcus Alonso, the wingback, jumping further forward. Both Jorginho and Kovacic, the double pivots, played a little bit higher and created this 3-4-3 structure to then create better access to the more advanced midfielders in Juventus's lineup. Now, when Juventus moved further forward, we could see that their back line played relatively deep and their fullback maintained a deeper positioning alongside the central defenders to then give them more cover and control in possession to protect against an offensive transition of Chelsea. And then in their midfield three, we have a clear midfield three with then a lot of fluidity from their front three to then drop between the lines and create a four-man midfield. And this tended to develop later on towards the game with more fluidity and more free players trying to get on the ball between the lines. And then we see the structure for Chelsea with their two players up forward and then their triangular midfield three to create access to both of the advanced midfielders of Juventus and block off access to the pivot, looking to force Juventus to play into wide areas where Chelsea had good access and could isolate possession. Here we see again the deep fullbacks for Juventus, creating a lot of space for their front players to move into and their offensive midfielders to drift into wide areas. But the key difference in this picture is now the creation of a four-man midfield, and now we can start to see the asymmetry among the wide areas. So Cuadrado is the player holding the width on the right hand side with the deep and narrow fullback sharing the same wide area as Cuadrado, but now we see one lone forward with the other dropping deeper to then create a diamond midfield, and then the solo width being held by the fullback on the weak side. So this created asymmetry and forced Chelsea to defend each side differently. And as we see their front three players looking to block off access to the holding midfielder, cut off circulation, as well as the shifting of the two holding midfielders of Chelsea to create staggering to try and create a higher level of spatial control. But this created a free player in midfield, which was the weak side offensive midfielder or the weak side fullback. The reasoning for the deeper positioning of their back line and even their offensive midfielders, as we see here, the midfielders come very deep and create tight connections among the back line and their midfield line. But what this did is it was to create a higher level of attraction among the Chelsea press. So when Chelsea would step forward with their holding midfielders and their front three, it would then look to create space between the lines for their more offensive players. Now with Chelsea in possession, they didn't change too much. They've lined up this in similar structure for almost the entirety of the season with their back three and their two holding midfielders, playing against the Juventus structure that looked to change quite a lot. So they changed from a 4-4-2 to a 4-1-4-1, and then in deeper areas they looked to create a 5-3-2 as the game progressed. So here we'll look at their 4-1-4-1 in their mid block, and this is where they were most comfortable in the midfield third and deeper. So in their mid to low block is where they look to play most of the game to limit the space of Chelsea and limit the space Chelsea had to create their numerical advantage. So in this 4-1-4-1, we can see the matchup from Juventus's midfield and forward lined up very well against Chelsea's team. So we have the wide midfielders oriented towards the wide central defenders, as well as the more offensive midfielders of Juventus looking to press the two holding midfielders. Now what this did was it created space in either half space between the lines where Ziyech or Havertz could then exploit. So now we can see the entire structure with the back four looking to play very narrow because of the threat of the offensive midfielders of Chelsea. We have our single holding midfielder creating a higher level of vertical compactness between the lines and looking to stagger himself to create a higher level of spatial control as well. Now we have our four midfielders in front of our holding midfielder and our lone striker. So now this structure changed quite a lot to then deal with the threat of Chelsea. So here we have our four-man midfield with our two holding midfielders looking to come deeper. And in the midfield third, when Chelsea did have space to exploit this four-man midfield, the free players was often created through the wingbacks or even the attacking midfielders because of their numerical advantage in this midfield line. So we have one wingback on the weak side in line with the Juventus midfield. Then we have a four-man central midfield asymmetric box, which draws Juventus's midfielders further forward, attracting them to the double pivot, and it pins the back four pretty narrow because of the threat of their offensive midfielders in the half space. So in turn, this often left players like Marcos Alonso free to then progress further forward and create a 2v1, which is why Juventus favored defending in deeper positions. Now we can take a look at an example of Juventus switching to a 4-4-2, and they did this a few times, changing formation throughout the match, and this was more just because of the Chelsea movement and a response to being broken or different situations when they were shifting. So now we have a clear 4-4-2 with Chiesa and Bernardeschi playing as the two players further forward, and this actually gave them more stability when their midfield was shifting. So now their wide midfielder could shift out to a progressing center defender, and he'd be covered by a midfield three behind him, looking to then limit the space between the lines, with their back four often becoming very stretched and being attracted to players between the lines, or looking to create a +1 numerical advantage against Lukaku. As we see, their central defenders are becoming very split because of their man orientation and tracking of the runners. But in the low block with minimal space and minimal runners in behind, this wasn't exploited very often from Chelsea. Now the last picture, we can look at Juventus's 5-3-2, and this came from Cuadrado's orientation to Marcos Alonso, creating a back five and trying to deal with the high level of players Chelsea commit to their last line against a low block. So their wingbacks advance, which forces Cuadrado to drop deeper to limit Chelsea's creation of a free man in these dangerous positions. Then we have a three-man midfield to block off each of the central corridors and two forwards to control the double pivot. And that's going to wrap up today's video. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.